Hi everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 31st. And as you know, we had a snow day last class. Technically, when the college is closed for inclement weather, then we're not supposed to hold online classes because students might be struggling with internet connections or electricity. And it was early enough in the semester that I thought it would just make sense to cancel class since we're still in introductory materials. So do keep up with the readings, even though I'm going to be falling behind because I'm going to be catching up sooner rather than later. And you can see that our past classes are in the folder above entitled Past Class Sessions. So what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about plagiarism, something that I didn't get a chance to mention last class when we were doing basically just an introduction. I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline, and I had you all introduce yourselves in the discussion forum. As for my introduction, I was born and raised in New York City, attended college in upstate New York, the University of Rochester, in part because I was very intrigued by their marketing, indicating that students who would attend their school could experience, quote, real winters, unquote. Well, that sounded very romantic, and you are probably aware, as I am now, that a real winter isn't always romantic. But there I was, majoring in English, minoring in psychology, absolutely positively certain I was going to be a lawyer. But I took a Shakespeare class that changed my life, and I realized that's really what I wanted to do. So instead of law school, I went to graduate school in a place that did not have real winters. I went to a rather temperate climate, Southern California, UCLA to be exact, where I majored in Shakespeare and his contemporaries, and then ultimately finished up my graduate career and began teaching and realized that I was starting to miss winter after all. Applied to a number of positions, and there was one at a school called Greenfield Community College, and the rest is history. I've been here since 1993, believe it or not. I remember very clearly my interview where we were talking about what my transition might be like from California, and I was assured that in Massachusetts, the winters here, this is also a quote, are not that bad, unquote. And maybe that's true in 2024, but it certainly wasn't in the 1993-94 winter academic year, which is my first year in Massachusetts, a year that broke all kinds of existing records for cold and ice. So it was truly brutal. But I remained and have remained ever since, mostly teaching English classes, but also some public speaking classes, some personal communication skills classes, film classes, even a class in horror film. So I have lots of eclectic tastes. And as you know, what I had assigned for today, very optimistically, were some introductory readings from our textbook. And you may not necessarily have access to the textbook yet, but note that there is a copy of the textbook on reserve in the GCC library that you can scan. And whenever I can find links from the actual readings that we're going to be doing over the course of the semester, then I will certainly share them with you. These introductory readings, I was not able to find free links online because of copyright protection. And if you have had a chance to do the readings, you'll see that they're a bit dry. This is not the literature that we will be reading over the course of the semester. This is preparing us to read the literature. And I also have a handout, which if we were meeting face to face, I would distribute to you now. But instead, you can find it in the syllabus and other documents folder. And I will be reviewing that handout as well, where it talks a little bit about reading not literature, but reading film, because you can apply the same skills to film that you would to a piece of literature. So I had asked you to read the pages 1 through 7, at least in the edition that I had ordered for the class, about reading imaginative literature. Again, I'll go a little bit more quickly than I normally would to try to catch up a bit. But basically, literature doesn't lend itself to a specific, tidy definition. And we'll spend the entire semester trying to define literature. I suppose in the broadest sense of the term, literature is anything that's written. So we could go to an appliance store, for instance, and ask for a piece of literature about a microwave oven because it's something that's written and it communicates. But that's not usually the kinds of literature that we're talking about when we're talking about English classes. We're usually talking about fiction, something that is creative, something that is imaginative. something that will not just entertain or not just something that will just generate profit, though there's nothing wrong with entertaining or generating profit. But it tries to broaden our perspectives, and it oftentimes provides some element of social commentary. That said, we don't have to agree with the social commentary, but we need to be able to identify it before we determine whether we agree or disagree. And it also uses language in interesting and creative ways. So that's the I suppose that's the way to think about literature. My personal informal definition of literature is something that can be reread, and each time you reread it, it has new meaning and new possibility associated with it. So once you read that microwave instruction manual, or once you read a newspaper article and you understand it, there isn't any reason to reread it. But something like a poem or a play or a short story, you could reread it dozens, hundreds of times and find new meaning and new interpretation. Now, one of the things that I included in the syllabus and other documents folder was an article that appeared in the New York Times entitled Your Brain on Fiction. And what they did was quite interesting in that, and you can see that you can click on that and access the PDF. And they tried to use MRI machines. Actually, they more than tried. They used MRI machines to try to determine what happens in our brain when we are actually reading a piece of creative writing, a piece of fiction. And what they found, quite interestingly, is that our brain engages in very similar sorts of brain waves when it's either participating in an activity or just reading about the same activity. So I'll let you read it yourself, but just very briefly, just to highlight a couple of places that what scientists have come to realize in the last few years is that narratives activate many parts of our brain, suggesting why the experience of reading can feel so alive. That words like lavender and cinnamon and soap, which are associated with scent, for instance, elicit a response not just from the language processing areas of our brain, that we would expect, but also those areas of the brain devoted to scent, even though those words don't have scent. The objects have scent, but the words don't. So lots of studies, and actually these are global studies. The first reference was from 2006 from Spain, where individuals were asked to read words with strong odor associations. Since this was a study from Spain, the words were in Spanish. And they also read neutral words. And MRI machines were used to scan what was happening in their brain. When subjects looked at words for perfume and coffee, the area of the brain associated for scent lit up. However, when they read words such as chair and key, words that don't have any kind of associations with scents, the area of the brain associated with scent remained dark. And they find this over and over again. Even something like a metaphor, like a rough day. We use this so frequently that it would seem that it wouldn't necessarily be associated with any tactile elements. Yet, when Emory University studied subjects, what they found was that when subjects read a metaphor, comparing two dissimilar things, involving texture, the area of the brain associated with the sensory elements, for instance, the sensory cortex, were activated. So the area of the brain associated with touch. Metaphors like the singer had a velvet voice or he had leathery hands roused the sensory cortex because of the words associated with touch. While sentences with similar meanings but with language that was not associated with tactile sensations, such as the singer had a pleasing voice or he had strong hands, didn't activate the sensory cortex. And another study in France found pretty much very similar kinds of results. In this instance, what they were doing is that they were scanning the brains of individuals reading simple sentences, such as John grasped the object or Pablo kicked the ball. And what they found out is that there was activity in the motor cortex, the area of the brain associated for movement. Even more interestingly, if you were reading about a movement in a particular part of the body, then that part of the brain associated with the part of the body was activated, even though you weren't moving that part of the body, you were just reading about it. So what does all of this mean? It suggests that basically the brain doesn't make much of a distinction about between reading about something and actually experiencing it. And if that's the case, then this is huge. This means this is the closest you're actually going to get to having an experience without experiencing it. And for instance, anybody who's experienced love will tell you that reading about love is a pale substitute. But it would seem that the brain doesn't really differentiate between the two. And this gives us the opportunity to engage in all kinds of activities that we would never have the opportunity to in our real lives. Skydiving, for instance, if you've never had a chance to skydive, but perhaps have a chance to read about it. And that fiction, with its details and its metaphors and all of the elements associated with it, offers an especially rich replica of reality. And not only that, it allows us to fully enter into other people's thoughts and feelings. This is perhaps the closest we're ever going to get to somebody else's thoughts and feelings. Yeah, somebody can tell us how they're thinking or what they're feeling, but they may be lying. They may be incorrect. They may be uncertain. Outside of our actually experiencing it ourselves, and sometimes we ourselves are uncertain of our own thoughts and feelings. And if these studies are correct, this means this is the closest you can get to having somebody else's experience. And think about how useful that would be in terms of navigating human relationships, which is really what literature is about. It's about examining humans and the human connection. And I encourage you to do that. And think about reading literature as something that ultimately is more than just an academic exercise, but it also is an opportunity for you to learn how to navigate social relationships in your world. And when I think about the plagiarism section in the textbook and the syllabus, I should say, that I had initially skipped, or I was so careful to try not to plagiarize by using quotation marks and listing my source and the page number, that plagiarism, at least according to the Modern Language Association, is using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. And that's as a kind of theft, but rather than taking property, you're taking somebody's intellectual property by not giving them credit. And that the consequences can be dire. You could fail an assignment. In fact, that's the least serious consequence. The most is that you could be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarize. So it's pretty serious. And I used to give a couple of stories to encourage people not to plagiarize. One happened to me, literally, when I was in college, when I was basically, or I should say, I was beginning my teaching career, and I was reading some college papers, and I realized one sounded familiar, and it didn't take me long to figure out why, and I didn't have to rely on the internet, as many sources as exist to help students plagiarize. An equal number of sources help students or help teachers determine if students are plagiarizing. And what I found was that ultimately, this was quoted exactly from our textbook verbatim. And, I've told this story many, many times. And another story that was perhaps even better was around the same time period, not with me, but a middle-aged professor reviewing papers and realizing something was familiar. Again, not able to go to the internet, but was able to rely on his memory and realized that he hadn't read it before, he had written it. And this means something extraordinary happened. It was one of his old papers from decades earlier. And somehow, some way, the student got a hold of it. It has something to do with a fraternity recycling papers. But the reality of it is that those two stories will kind of sort of summarize why you didn't want to take the chance with plagiarizing. And of course, artificial intelligence has changed everything. So now the little the little blurb that I have on the syllabus seems so insufficient. But I encourage you not to rely on artificial intelligence in this particular class. I'd like us to focus on thinking. And the way to think is to exercise our brains. And if literature does indeed teach us about humanity, then it teaches us about ourselves and others. And I would ask you to allow that experience to happen, as this handout, Your Brain on Fiction, suggests does happen. Also, I know that one of the temptations for artificial intelligence is because individuals are concerned about their grades. But I very deliberately established the class so that you don't have to be too worried about grades. A good portion of the class is just responding to discussion forum questions on a regular basis. And these responses are not evaluated. They just count as your attendance, but they're not evaluated on a letter scale. And I want you to read all of your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. As you can see, I also responded. This will give you an idea of what happened in the class discussion. So hopefully this will generate some thinking. And also, I like to ask questions that don't necessarily have a factual answer, questions that require reasoning, because the reasoning is oftentimes more important. And your first paper, which is due by the midpoint of the semester, but hopefully earlier, you have the option to rewrite. So I see it as a learning exercise where you can get a higher grade. And your second paper is going to be due at the end, so you probably wouldn't have a chance to rewrite it. But I encourage you to submit in early papers. If you can get it in early enough, we might be able to negotiate. But regardless, the second paper should just be a repetition of what you learned from the first paper. And the final exam is open book, open notes. It's not about memorization. So if you keep up with the reading and you watch all the videos, which is basically what you have to do, watch all the class videos, keep up with all of the assigned readings on our syllabus, and read all of the class discussion forum responses from yourself and others, you'll be prepared for the final examination. So I use all of this as evidence to try to avoid something like artificial intelligence. Plus, I leave you with a little story from a few months ago where an attorney used artificial intelligence to put together one of his court briefs. And he verified through artificial intelligence that the information was accurate, presented it to the judge, and the judge did some fact checking and found that the information was not accurate, that the cases that were being cited had never existed. So this is problematic on a whole host of levels, especially if someone is relying on artificial intelligence for accurate information, because it doesn't always give accurate information. Whether it was because there was some sort of problem with the programming and the algorithm, so that's an issue. Or whether or not it was deliberately trying to deceive, that's an even bigger issue if we've got self-awareness. I've even read that artificial intelligence tends to, the language used is hallucinate, quote unquote. And that also is another very problematic issue in terms of consciousness. So I put all those things together and I encourage you, please don't use artificial intelligence. Rely on yourself. And there are safeties embedded in the class so that you can improve your grade. And by reading the literature, not only will you be able to expand your reading and your writing skills, but you'll learn about yourself and others. And certainly your brain on fiction suggests that that is one of the most powerful things about reading literature. So as I move forward, and I talk a little bit, again, you can see the notes below here, about how Moby Dick, which is a famous literary work that you've probably heard of before, was not initially considered literature. So literature can be quite subjective. It was only after the fact when it was revisited and read from a symbolic perspective rather than literal perspective. It was initially considered to be a study of whales, and that's where it was housed in libraries. So how do you determine quality in terms of literature? And this is related to the canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics and teachers to be worthy of academic study. And of course, there's some subjectivity to this, but there also are some criteria. Much like with evaluating a paper, let's say from a student, somewhat subjective, but there are also criteria for what an A or a B or a C might look like. So in terms of determining the canon, those works considered by scholars and critics to be worth academic study, I wanted to talk a little bit about how those scholars and critics basically made a profession of literary analysis. And that gets us into the readings, critical strategies for readings. Basically, initially, in the 1800s or so, is when scholars and critics got together and tried to formalize the study of literature as a profession, much like law and much like medicine. They needed to call themselves something, so they called themselves the formalists because they were looking at the formal elements of a work. They were looking at its language, its structure, its tone, and this predisposed that there was a certain level of expertise that you had about literary studies that you could apply to that analysis. And in some ways, it's a very classist argument, especially when you think about how most of the scholars and critics at the time were from a very small demographic group. Usually male, usually Caucasian, usually heterosexual. More often than not, choosing works from the past. So students are reading works not only from oftentimes reflections of those scholars and critics' life experience in terms of gender or in terms of ethnicity or in terms of sexual orientation. But if nothing else, students were reading works from the past from authors who were dead more often than not, and were asking questions like, where am I represented in this? So starting around the 1940s and 1960s, which not coincidentally was around the time that college classrooms became much more diverse, in part because of the GI Bill, but college classrooms very much reflected the scholars and critics of the time that were determining canon. Those works considered by scholars and critics deemed worthy of study. So a new group came along in the 1940s to 1960s. They had to call themselves something. They called themselves the New Critics, which I think is a poor term because what's new today is old tomorrow. So while they were new in the 40s and the 60s, they're not necessarily new now. But nevertheless, it weren't that forward thinking. The New Critics focused on a close reading of the text, and it didn't assume any prior knowledge that anybody could engage in literary analysis, a second grader or someone in their second year of graduate school, or everything in between. Obviously, the analysis would be more complex the more knowledge somebody had. And I can tell you that classrooms across America were influenced by this kind of reading, so that somebody could read a poem, let's say Emily Dickinson, in the second grade and begin to grapple with it, even though somebody grappling with the same poem in college would get much more out of that poem. But you could look at things like use of language and irony, things that are unexpected, but that have a kind of twist element to them. Things like a fire occurring in a firehouse, I think is the example that's given to you. Or something like one of my favorite examples, an old Twilight Zone episode. And let me tell you that the original Twilight Zone was, their episodes were written by some of the best short story writers of the day. You may be familiar with this episode, Time Enough at Last, where the main character basically is rather meek, and he is henpecked by his wife and bullied by his boss. The main character works in a bank. It turns out that all the main character wants to do is spend time reading, but his wife wants him to do chores and his boss wants him to perform his job. And one day the main character is left alone at work at the ending of the workday, and he locks himself in the bank vault by mistake. He's not terribly competent in his job. And while he's locked in the bank vault, there's nuclear war, which destroys society. However, this character is able to survive because they were protected by the bank vault. So we have to suspend some disbelief here. And initially, the main character sort of works his way out of the rubble and is horrified by the devastation he sees around him. But then he's rather overjoyed because he realizes he has time enough at last, hence the name of the episode, to do what he really wants to do, read. And he's not going to be bothered by his boss or his wife or anybody else. So he's able to make his way to the ruins of a library and gather a whole bunch of books. Again, we have to suspend some disbelief here that the books would have survived. Nevertheless, he organizes them all and gets ready to read. And as he looks down, and keep in mind the Twilight Zones, the originals were in the 1950s, his glasses, which are very, very thick, they fall off or slide off of his face like so. The glasses made out of glass, which is how glasses were made at that time. And the glasses fall onto the pavement and shatter. And now he has time enough at last to read, but he can't see. And in my mind, that's one of the best examples that I can think of irony. Or paradox, two seemingly contradictory terms. Or symbolism, where one thing represents another. Usually it's something concrete, like a flag, representing something that's not concrete, like an emotion, let's say patriotism. or a metaphor comparing two dissimilar things without using like or as, or plot, which is the basic level reading that you need to know what happened. Without that, you can't do anything else. But it's what I call the junior high school book report. Not just what happened, but more importantly to all of us, our class is about why did those things happen, which involves a certain level of interpretation. We're almost like lawyers, taking and gathering pieces of evidence and presenting a position. And a good lawyer can argue either side of the case with the same evidence. Obviously, some pieces of evidence might be stronger than others, but a good lawyer can take what they've got and present it in a way that is convincing. And then it's up to a judge to make a decision based on the presentation of evidence, not on their personal bias. And it's the same thing with you writing a paper. You're gathering up pieces of evidence from a piece of text to take a position that reasonable people could disagree about. And it doesn't matter what my position is as, quote, judge, unquote, if you want to think of me that way. I have to rely on the evidence that you presented to see if you have a valid case. And in theory, you could write two papers that completely contradict one another about the same text and get an A on each of them because you've put together your evidence in such a compelling way. Or just thinking about things like characters. Who are the characters or who's telling the story? And these are very interesting elements. And we use these all the time in our daily interactions. We don't just evaluate what somebody says to us. We also evaluate who is saying it to us. So sometimes we know that we can trust or not trust the source of information. And that colors the way that we interpret the information that we're given. Same with the reading. Who is giving us the information? How would it change if somebody else was? So the new critics were very popular for a while. The job market became very tough for literary scholars. I think that that's one of the reasons why all of these subspecialties branched out. It's a little bit of a cynical perspective, I'm aware, but there were all of these different schools, as you can see in the notes below. Biographical critics focus on biography. Makes sense. You need to know something about the author's life to understand their writing because they're probably writing from experience. But, there is a big but. How do we know we're getting accurate information about the author's life? And just because an author is writing about something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's autobiographical. Psychological critics looked at just that, mental states, whether it be the psychology of the author writing the text, the psychology of the characters themselves, using the characters as almost case studies, if you will. Or the psychology of us, the reader, and why did we respond in a particular way to a reading. Please excuse that. That's my telephone. That's part of the problems with taping live, or recording live, I should say. Historical critics looked at just that, history of past events. But history is subjective. And history is oftentimes told by the victor. So if you study history from another culture, you'll see you'll get a very different kind of perspective on it. And just think about how someone like Christopher Columbus has gone from hero to villain to someplace in between. So history is just as influenced by canon, those works considered, or those events considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of study, and they could be debated, and they usually, more often than not, reflect the backgrounds of the individuals who are making the decisions. Marxist critics, they used economics, and they were looking at socioeconomics specifically when reading literature, money, and how money is related to power or lack of power. New historicist critics, also a somewhat troubling term because what's new becomes old. But the new historicists, because we already had the historical critics, so they had to call themselves something else, weren't just looking at historical events, they were looking at culture. Groups of individuals that share behaviors and values and attitudes and beliefs. Things like dress and diet and music. To really understand a people's media studies, in effect, something that I'm quite interested in. Gender critics looked at just that, gender. Sometimes they looked at the feminine, sometimes they looked at the masculine, sometimes they looked at non-binary, sometimes they looked at all of the above. Mythological critics looked at myths, those universal stories that seem to be told generation after generation and across cultures. Interesting factoid, just about every culture has a resurrection myth. The myths and stories are different, but the general theme of resurrection continues. Reader response critics. This one is quite interesting to many readers because it puts the power in the reader's hands, not the writer's. It's not about the reader trying to decipher what the writer is trying to say. It's about the reader and their interpretation. That said, you have to be careful not to misunderstand this kind of approach. It's not that just because I read something, it can mean anything I want it to mean because I'm the reader and I have power. But if there's evidence in the text to support a position, there are other readers that can also acknowledge that there's evidence in the text to support that position. Then the position is valid, even if the author says that position is not valid. Deconstructionist critics. So if you know the word deconstruction, to take apart, well, all of these literary forms, they take apart. But this particular form of interpretation comes from philosophy, from a philosophical theory called deconstruction, a philosopher called Jacques Derrida, or named Jacques Derrida, French, who had talked about how there is no meaning, that everything collapses upon itself because everything has contradiction. So if you apply this to literature, you're looking for all of the contradiction that exists, and in theory, it's almost like adding a positive and a negative number. You end up with a zero, in effect. It was a very popular theory in the 80s and 90s, which is when I was in school and beginning my career. Standing room only audiences with some of the leading scholars and critics of the time. And I believe the reason why is because it was so complex that most people didn't understand. And I can say that I didn't understand when I was studying in graduate school. I found out my classmates didn't understand when I went to class to see what they thought about it. And we were all stunned to find out that one of the leading scholars in literary theory at UCLA, who had taught for decades, when he walked into the room, acknowledged to us that he too didn't truly understand deconstruction, even though he'd been teaching it and had been talking about it for years. But he would try his best to try to muddle through it with us. So I wonder if that's the reason why deconstruction was so interesting. It lost a lot of its cachet, in part because, and it took years for people to figure this out, there is a flaw in the deconstructionist argument. And it's difficult to explain. I'm trying to oversimplify something that we could spend months or years studying, understand this. But basically, deconstruction argues that there is no meaning. But the argument that there is no meaning has meaning within it. That said, Jacques Derrida tried to defend his position, saying that, well, my position is as much of a contradiction as all of the other contradictions that exist in life. Therefore, this proves the validity of my literary interpretations of use of deconstruction for literary interpretations. But people became a lot less interested in deconstruction at that point. Plus, it's a rather nihilistic, sort of depressing way to view things, that you're looking for no meaning as opposed to looking for meaning. So this gives you just a little taste of the ways that you can analyze literature. Not that I want you to pick one of these and say, oh, I'm a Marxist and I'm going to view everything from the lens of socioeconomics. Let the text decide for you. And usually one or two will bubble to the top. Though in theory, we could go through all of these schools of literary interpretation for just one text. That would take all semester long. We don't have that kind of time. We'll read a text, a piece of literature, and then see which ways of interpretation seem the most obvious. And then we'll move on to something else. So that said, let the text determine for you. Think of yourself as a generalist, almost like a doctor. You're a general practitioner rather than a specialist, let's say a heart surgeon. And yes, heart surgeons are wonderful when you need heart surgery. You want a specialist. But sometimes heart surgeons miss the most obvious things because they aren't general practitioners and they're not thinking beyond their specialty. And I liken that to literary studies, that if you become too much of a specialist, too much focused on a particular way of analysis, you might miss something that's very obvious. So reading fiction, it's careful, deliberate reading, and that means rereading. And I suggest 3 readings for each text. The first for plot, what's happening. The second for analysis, why is it happening? And the third, immediately before you're going to discuss it or write about it or listen to a class video about it, as is our case, to remind yourself of what you read. And I understand that practically that might not be possible, but each time you reread something, you get new meaning from it. So it's not that you've read something and you're done. You can read something dozens, hundreds of times. Think about Shakespeare. People are still finding new meaning in Shakespeare. And you would think that after all of the reading that's occurred over the centuries, everything that has been said about Shakespeare could be said. And yet individuals are finding more. Annotating, taking notes. So the thing is that if you're reading and you're reading really carefully, more than just for plot, you're beginning to ask yourself why. Why are these things happening? And you're beginning to formulate some suppositions, questions, thoughts. The thing is, we have notoriously poor memories. So if you don't write it down, chances are you will forget. So annotate your text. I prefer still paper texts. I think they're easier to annotate. Or if you're working online, you can just take hand notes, or you can start a new screen. In fact, you can even do something a little bit more formal, journaling, where basically, much like a diary, but rather than writing about your personal life, you're writing about school, specifically the assignments in a particular class. And the beauty of it is that it's for no one's eyes but your own. You don't have to worry about grammar. You don't have to worry about mechanics. The textbook will oftentimes provide textbooks at the ending of the pieces of literature. This can also help guide your reading. Because this will give you clues of what's important, things that we're likely to discuss in class. In fact, I've had some students say that they prefer to read the questions at the ending of the texts that we're reading before they begin reading, so they have an idea what to look for. Other students say no, they don't want spoilers. They want to read first and then they'll read questions after the fact. So one of the things that was in the reading that I had assigned about reading fiction, which is section 3 in the notes below, you can see those notes are much like what I would post on a whiteboard, that there is a short story entitled Story of an Hour that they were using as an example about how to take notes on. I'm going to revisit that short story with us as a class next week, where we analyze that story together. So again, you've probably read it once, because it was embedded in the readings about reading fiction to show you how to take notes. But I'm going to ask you to read it again next week and to read it very carefully so that we can interpret. If you want some examples of annotation, at least in the version of the text that I had ordered for class, that would be on page 17, and an example of a journal on page 20, if you so want it. But those are merely examples. Now, that said, the textbook doesn't really talk much about film, and I didn't want to order a separate text for film. So instead, I have a handout that I wanted to talk about that I uploaded onto our syllabus and other documents folder. And the handout I would distribute as a physical copy if we were meeting. And it talks about how to read a film, that you can read a film in the way that you could read a piece of literature. Yes, you can watch film for entertainment, and yes, film can be generated for profit. But really good film that is part of canon, those works that scholars and teachers and critics deem worthy of study, probably does more than just generate profit or entertain. Probably does many of the same things we've talked about with literature, that it's unique and it's creative and it tries to make some sort of a social statement. Both movies and literature utilize storytelling, but in movies, pictures tell the story. We watch movies. We don't say that we hear movies. We watch movies. In literature, words tell the story. So it's a different kind of reading. So you want to become very conscious about the way that you absorb visual imagery. We're more likely to probably watch movies than read books. It's harder to read. You have to use your imagination in ways you don't when you're watching television or watching a film. A lot of the information is given to you. Film is the only literary form where the text moves and also has a sense of permanence, unlike something like a drama, where ultimately, yes, the text moves, let's say, but it's not permanent unless it's filmed. You see it once and then it's gone. Films are motion. Think about the term we use, motion pictures. And they show us rather than tell us. And if something is shown in a film, it's probably important. Just like if something is stated in a piece of literature, it's probably important. Sometimes you have misdirection where an author is deliberately trying to make you believe one thing and then it turns out that it's something else. The same can happen in film. There's actually a term for this in film. It comes from Alfred Hitchcock, famous director you might be familiar with, a MacGuffin. And a MacGuffin is basically a deliberate misdirection where it doesn't mean anything at all. Psycho is a good example of that, a film that I talk about in my horror film class. I don't want to give too many spoilers about it if you haven't seen it, but it's an excellent film. And film images offer suggestion. You can interpret them in the way that you can interpret language. The issue with film is that we've got multiple layers because we've got a camera person and that camera person is doing a lot of the thinking for us. So yes, you've got a writer of a script, but then you've got a camera person and you also have a director who is basically instructing actors on how to interpret a role. And you've got things like lighting and you've got things like music. So there are all of these levels. If you're a fan of the Academy Awards, then you'll see how many individuals are involved in the making of a film. When you're reading, it should be basically something that is between the author of the text and yourself. But now we've got all these multiple levels with film. And unlike when we're watching a live drama, where we get to decide where to put our attention, the camera selects what we see when we are watching a film. And film is a lot like live drama in that you're storytelling through character and through dialogue, but obviously you've got the possibility of special effects with film that you wouldn't have with drama. And of course, with film, you've got to look through the lens of the camera as opposed to deciding where to look. So we can analyze film now much better so than we could in the past because we didn't have home access before. So I remember the days before we had things like VHS, I'm dating myself here, and DVD, again, I'm dating myself here, and streaming. And the ability to have home access allows us to do things like not only watch in the comfort of our homes, but watch multiple times and rewind and fast forward. So now we can do many of the things we do when we read, when we reread and we go back and we take notes and so forth. We previously, when we were watching film, couldn't pause for reflection the way we do with reading, but now we can because of technology. And film, just like literature, is oftentimes classified by a genre, which is just a kind of category. And, sometimes they're very predictable and trite and cliche. So you know what you're going to find in a rom-com. You know what you're going to find in a horror film. You know what you're going to find in a romance novel. However, sometimes you can have a piece of literature that still follows a genre. Shakespeare did this, for instance, when he was writing comedies, and they followed certain criteria. And histories, they follow certain criteria. And tragedies, and they follow certain criteria. Yet, they were not cliche. They were still original and creative. But Shakespeare broke all the rules. It's not easy, as I'm sure you're well aware of, to show a character's internal mental state in film. It's much easier to do it in writing, because when you're writing, you can expose a character's thoughts by saying he thought or she thought. They thought. In film, it becomes a little bit more complex. They're either going to have to express their thoughts through dialogue or through behavior or facial expressions, or there's going to have to be some sort of a voiceover. So it's a little bit more complex. Now, think about when we talk about movie magic. There is this kind of magic associated with movies in that they're based on illusion, and it doesn't just have to be limited to special effects, which we will talk about when we talk about Citizen Kane, which is the first film that we'll be studying this semester. But expect 3 acts, if you will, for lack of a better word, in a film. A beginning, a middle, and an end, which is pretty typical of all stories, pretty typical of all pieces of writing, including your own papers. Act 1, for film, approximately 30 minutes or so, and this is where we get our introductions to character. The thing with film is that we usually have an expectation of length. About an hour and a half, give or take a little bit on either end. Though we certainly have films that go under, short films, and films that go over. But usually audiences start getting antsy once you hit the 2-hour mark with the film. Act 2, 30 to 60 minutes in a film. This is where we've got conflict. And all stories have conflict, or else there wouldn't be a story. There wouldn't be interest in it. And Act 3 in a film, the last 30 minutes, resolution. And I guess you can say the same thing with fiction, in that you have an introduction to characters, you've got some conflict, and then you've got a resolution. The length is different, of course, if you're reading a short story as opposed to reading or watching a drama. And some terms from film that you may or may not be familiar with that'll help you to talk about film, just like there's some terms about literature. A frame is a single shot. Basically, all films are pictures, single pictures. In fact, 24 frames, 24 pictures per second is the way that we see animation. Each shot should tell a story. Scenes are series of frames that tell the story, and sequences are multiple scenes that tell that story. So things to think about: choreography, the movement, all of this is blocked out. Cinematography, the kind of filming that's done, and it's not just necessarily black and white as opposed to color. A lot of it has to do with the film stock and the camera angles. Sound, audio. Again, these are awards that are given in things like the Academy Awards. Scene framing. So what is it that the camera is going to be showing us or not showing us? Cutting, fading, dissolving. How are we going to go about moving from one image to the next? Are we just going to cut from one to the next? Will it fade out? Will it dissolve? Some combination thereof. The camera angles. The lighting. The distances between shots. Usually medium shots provide us with the most information as compared to close-ups where you focus on an element, usually someone's face or a thing, or a long shot where it's too far necessarily to focus on any particular element. Dollying is when you can run the camera back and forth so that you can get a much more fluid image. Zooming, when you go closer or farther away. Notice how these are some terms that we use with photography as well. Panning, a stationary camera that moves side by side, and that'll give you a very different sense of a scene. Sound isn't just dialogue or sound effects. It's also musical score, too. And as I had indicated, film. Remember, in the early days of film, there was no choice. It had to be black and white. Now, oftentimes, black and white is used for artistry or to suggest distance or to suggest something from the past. That black and white sets a mood or a tone. But in the early days of film, there was no choice. So these are some things to consider when you are thinking about film and also thinking about literature. I hope that this was a fairly good review of what I had assigned for you to read today. Realize you might not have had a chance to read it, but you can always go back after the fact and read it. There is a copy of the text on reserve in the GCC library that you can scan if you'd like. And next class, you'll notice that we've got some readings from our textbook, How to Write About Fiction, now that we've talked about how to read fiction. Writing about film, another handout that I'll share with you. The writing process, that's also included in our textbook. Skimming the glossary of literary terms, and by skim, I mean that, skim. I don't expect you to read the glossary. I want you to know that a glossary exists in your textbook and that you could utilize it. And I want to start talking about the film Citizen Kane and why it's such an incredibly important film, despite its age. So our attendance question on our class discussion forum, and you have 48 hours in which to answer your attendance question. So if you are watching this video today on Wednesday, though I'm hoping to post it on Tuesday night, but if you're watching the video on Wednesday, then your discussion forum response is due Friday, which is the 2nd of February. If you need additional time, please ask me. I'll be happy to grant you an extension. And your question, which is not a question that is about right or wrong. It's a question about reasoning, the kinds of questions I like to ask. What do you think makes a piece of literature or film worthy of being included in the canon, and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I'll end with the cartoon that I have at the bottom of the page of our notes about banned books. And I can tell you right now that this is a major issue. It has been through time, but especially now that we're in such a heated political climate about what should or should not be read. You can probably tell from the cartoon that I'm not a big fan of censorship. And in fact, if you read some of the titles of what we will be studying this semester, whether it be film or literature, a combination of the two, some of them are under scrutiny in some school districts, particularly K through 12, which has more stringent rules about whether or not they should be banned. But again, I personally am not a fan of censorship. I believe you should read everything and then make decisions for yourself. But I thought that this cartoon might be applicable to the fact that we will be reading and watching some controversial things over the course of the semester. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.